The Arizona sun doesn't forgive. It just waits. Clara Bennett crawled across burning sand with blood on her dress and nowhere left to run. Behind her lay shame, bruises, and the wreckage of trust. Ahead was only emptiness. She'd been cast out like refuse, left to die where no one would ask questions. Her lips cracked, her vision blurred, then a shadow fell across her face. Not death, but a man. Dark-eyed, silent, dangerous in the way all survivors are. He offered water with one hand and an impossible bargain with the other. Marry me, or the desert keeps you both. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Clara's story travels. Hit that like button, and let's walk this journey together to the very end. The desert had no mercy, and Clara Bennett had stopped asking for any. She stumbled forward through a landscape that shimmered with heat, each step sinking into sand that grabbed at her boots like greedy hands. Her dress, once a modest gray cotton that might have passed for respectable, hung in tatters around her calves, the hem blackened with ash and streaked with rust-colored stains she didn't want to name. The sun hammered down on her bare head. She'd lost her bonnet somewhere back near the canyon mouth, though she couldn't remember when. Time had become elastic out here, stretching and contracting until minutes felt like hours, and hours collapsed into single burning moments of thirst. She'd been walking for 2 days, maybe 3. The canteen she'd stolen had run dry before noon on the first day, and she'd thrown it aside in a fit of rage that left her gasping. Stupid, wasteful. But rage was all she had left after everything else had been stripped away. The settlement of Copper Bend lay somewhere behind her now, swallowed by distance and dust. She would never go back, couldn't go back. Not after what Silas Crow had done, what he'd tried to do, and certainly not after she'd fought back. The memory made her stomach twist, his hands on her wrists, his breath reeking of whiskey and entitlement. The moment she'd grabbed the fire poker and swung it with everything she had. She hadn't stayed to see if he'd gotten back up. Run, her mind had screamed. Run and don't stop. So she'd run. Out of the boarding house where she'd worked for 3 months, scrubbing floors and dodging Crow's advances. Out past the edge of town where the road turned to hard pan. Out into the raw throat of the Arizona territory, where wanted posters didn't reach and questions didn't follow. Except now the desert was asking its own questions, and Clara didn't have answers. Her throat felt like it had been scraped with broken glass. Every breath came shallow and hot. She'd tried chewing on a pebble the way she'd heard prospectors did, to trick her mouth into making spit, but it only made things worse. The stone sat bitter against her teeth, and when she finally spat it out, there was blood on it. The sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and flame. Clara watched it without feeling. Beautiful things had stopped mattering. All that mattered was the next step, and the one after that, and the dim animal hope that maybe, there was water somewhere ahead. She crested a low rise and stopped. Below, nestled in a shallow basin between 2 rust-colored mesas, stood a cabin. Clara blinked hard, certain it was a mirage. But the structure remained solid against the fading light, rough-hewn logs chinked with dried mud, a slanted roof of mismatched planks, a stone chimney leaking a thin trail of smoke. It looked half-finished, like someone had started building and then given up, or been interrupted. A corral of crooked fence posts stood empty beside it. No animals, no movement. But smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. People meant water. Clara's legs moved before her mind caught up. She half ran, half slid down the slope, sand cascading around her ankles. Her lungs burned. Her vision tunneled. She could see nothing but that cabin, that chimney, that impossible promise of survival. She was 10 yards from the door when her knees buckled. The ground came up fast and hard, knocking the wind from her chest. She lay there gasping, tasting copper and grit. Her fingers clawed at the sand, trying to drag herself forward, but her arms had turned to water. Get up, she thought desperately. Get up, you fool! It's right there! But her body had finally reached its limit. Darkness crept in from the edges of her vision, soft and smothering. Clara's last conscious thought was a bitter one. Of course I'd die within sight of help. Then the world went black. Heat. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments, cool cloth against her forehead, the earthy smell of wet clay, rough wood beneath her cheek, and water, blessed, impossible water, dripping onto her cracked lips. Claire's eyes flew open. A man knelt beside her, silhouetted against the orange glow of a hearth. He held a tin cup in one hand and a damp rag in the other, his face shadowed and unreadable. Dark hair fell past his shoulders, shot through with a single streak of silver at his left temple. His skin was sun-darkened, his features sharp and angular, high cheekbones, a nose that had been broken at least once, a mouth set in a hard line. But his eyes were what stopped her, deep brown, almost black, and utterly calm. The kind of calm that comes from seeing too much and surviving it anyway. "Slowly," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. He tipped the cup against her lips again, letting just a few drops slide past. Clara wanted to grab it, to gulp it down, but her hands wouldn't obey. She managed a small swallow, then another. The water tasted like rain and metal and life itself. "More," she croaked. "Not yet. You'll be sick." He pulled the cup back, and Clara made a sound that might have been a sob or a curse. The man's expression didn't change. He dipped the rag into a wooden basin and wiped her face with methodical gentleness, cleaning away the layers of dust and dried sweat. "Where?" Clara's voice cracked. She tried again. "Where am I?" "My home. You collapsed outside." Clara tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. The room spun violently. Strong hands caught her shoulders, steadying her until the dizziness passed. "Easy," the man said. He eased her back against something soft. A bedroll, she realized, laid out on the packed earth floor. "You've been walking without water for days. Your body needs time." "How long was I?" 3 hours, maybe 4. It's full dark now." Clara looked past him, taking in the cabin's interior. It was sparse to the point of emptiness. A stone hearth with a cooking pot suspended over low flames. A rough table made from split logs. 2 chairs that didn't match. Shelves holding tin plates, a coffee pot, ammunition boxes. A rifle propped in the corner. Everything looked functional, hard used, and carefully maintained. The walls were bare logs, some still weeping sap. Gaps between them let in threads of night air. One corner of the cabin was curtained off with a blanket, probably where he slept. The whole place smelled like wood smoke, leather, and something sharper, sage maybe. This wasn't a home. It was a fortification. "Who are you?" Clara asked. The man sat back on his heels, studying her with those unsettling, calm eyes. Talon Greyhawk. The name settled into the silence between them. Clara waited for more. An explanation, a question, some indication of what he wanted from her, but nothing came. He simply watched her, patient as stone. "I'm Clara Bennett," she said finally, because the silence was worse than speaking. He nodded once, as if he'd been expecting her to have a name and now the formality was complete. "Why were you walking through the desert alone?" Talon asked. Clara's jaw tightened. "I had my reasons." "Those reasons nearly killed you." "Better the desert than what I left behind." Something flickered in his expression. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition, like he'd heard those words before, maybe even said them himself. "Where were you headed?" he asked. "Away." The word came out sharper than she intended. Clara forced herself to soften. "I heard there might be work in Prescott, or Tucson. Somewhere I could disappear." "Prescott's 100 miles north. Tucson's farther. You wouldn't have made it another day." Clara knew he was right, but the truth still stung. She looked away, focusing on the fire instead of his too knowing gaze. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for the water, for bringing me inside. I'll leave in the morning if you'll spare a canteen." "Where will you go? Does it matter?" "It does if you're planning to walk into the desert again." Talon stood, moving to the hearth. He ladled something from the pot into a wooden bowl and brought it back to her. Beans in a thin broth, studded with chunks of salt pork. The smell made Clara's stomach clench with sudden, desperate hunger. "Eat," he said, pressing the bowl into her hands. Slowly. Clara obeyed, spooning the warm food into her mouth with shaking fingers. It was simple, undersalted, but it tasted better than anything she could remember. She had to force herself not to wolf it down. Talon returned to the hearth and poured coffee into a battered tin cup. He didn't drink it, just held it, staring into the flames. "This land," he said abruptly. "It's contested." Clara paused mid-bite. What? The government says it's open territory, claims I can homestead it if I meet their requirements. His voice was flat, almost toneless. Build a permanent structure, cultivate the land, live here continuously for 5 years, then file a claim. So you're building the cabin, Clara said slowly. The cultivation, that's harder. Very little grows here. I've tried. He gestured vaguely toward the darkness beyond the door. There's a creek a half-mile west, seasonal. Enough to keep a few head of livestock alive, maybe plant beans or squash if I can divert the water. But that's not the real problem. Clara set down the bowl, suddenly wary. What is? Talon turned to face her fully. In the firelight, his features looked carved from shadow and old grief. The law says a homesteader can be single, but it also says that married men with families get priority consideration. More land, better terms. And if there's a dispute, he paused, a married man with a wife on the property has stronger standing. The pieces clicked together in Clara's mind, cold and inevitable as a sprung trap. You're alone, she said. Yes. And you need a wife. Yes. The word hung between them like smoke. Clara's laugh was sharp and broken. You can't be serious. I am. You don't know me. I could be anyone, a thief, a murderer. You're a woman running from something bad enough to risk the desert, Talon said evenly. That tells me you're desperate. Desperation, I understand. Clara shook her head, even though the motion made her dizzy. Why would you want someone desperate? Why not find a woman in one of the settlements? Someone respectable? Because respectable women don't need this, and I don't have time to court anyone. He spoke without emotion, laying out facts. There's a territorial inspector coming through in 6 months, maybe less. He'll decide whether my claim stands or gets absorbed back into federal land. If I'm married, with a household established, my chances improve significantly. So you want to use me? I want to offer you a trade. Clara stared at him. There was no warmth in his face, no charm, no attempt to soften the proposition. Just brutal honesty. What kind of trade? She asked, though she already knew the answer. You marry me. Live here as my wife for the next year, long enough to satisfy the homestead requirements and the inspection. In return, you get safety, shelter, and a legal name that's not your own. Whatever you're running from, it can't reach you here. No one comes out this far unless they're lost or looking for trouble. And after the year, you can leave or stay. I won't hold you either way. Clara's mind raced. It was insane. Marry a complete stranger? Live in the middle of nowhere with a man who looked like he'd been carved from the desert itself? She should refuse. She should walk away the moment dawn broke and take her chances with what? Copper Bend was impossible. She had no money, no references, no way to find legitimate work without someone asking questions she couldn't answer. Every town between here and California had men like Silas Crow, men who thought a woman alone was fair game, men who took what they wanted and called it natural. At least Talon Greyhawk was offering a contract, not an attack. Why me? Clara asked. Really? There has to be more to it. Talon's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. You're here. That's enough. Not for me, it isn't. I need the truth. He was silent for a long moment. Then, 3 years ago, my father died on this land. He was Pima, raised in the villages south of here. My mother was white, a trader's daughter from Santa Fe. They weren't married, but they lived as husband and wife for 20 years, built the start of this cabin together, worked a small claim. His voice remained steady, but Clara could hear the edges of old pain beneath the words. When he died, the territorial office said his claim was invalid, said he never filed the right papers, never proved continuous habitation. They wanted to take the land for auction. Talon's jaw tightened. I've been fighting that decision ever since, living here, building, trying to meet every requirement they set, even as they move the goalposts. And marriage is the new goalpost, Clara said softly. Yes. She understood now. This wasn't just about land. It was about erasure, about a system designed to grind people down until they disappeared. Talon was fighting not to vanish. And he was asking Clara to help him stand his ground. What would you expect from me? She asked. As a wife. Work, same as I do. maintain the household, help with the land, stand witness if the inspector comes. And at night? Talon met her gaze without flinching. Separate bedrolls, unless you decide otherwise. The directness of it should have been shocking, but somehow it wasn't. There was no hunger in his eyes, no presumption, just the same brutal honesty he'd shown from the start. Clara looked down at her hands. They were blistered, filthy, shaking slightly from exhaustion and hunger. 2 days ago, she'd been scrubbing floors in Copper Bend, trying to save enough money for a stagecoach ticket to anywhere else. Now she was sitting in a half-finished cabin in the desert, being offered a marriage of pure survival. It should have terrified her. Instead, she felt something strange and unfamiliar uncurling in her chest. Hope. "I have conditions," she said. Talon waited. "I keep my own name, Clara Bennett, for any personal dealings. The marriage is legal, but I'm not pretending it's something it isn't." "Agreed." "If I decide to leave after the inspector comes, you don't follow me, don't ask questions. We part ways clean." "Agreed." "And if you ever lay hands on me the way men like Silas Crow do, I'll put a bullet in you myself." For the first time, something almost like approval flickered across Talon's face. "Understood. Same goes the other way. You pull a weapon on me without cause, and we're done." Clara nodded slowly. It was a strange negotiation, more like two generals arranging a truce than two people planning a life together. But maybe that's exactly what it needed to be. "When?" she asked. "There's a circuit preacher who comes through Gila Bend once a month. Next visit's in 8 days. We'll ride out, get the papers signed, and be back before sunset. And until then, you rest, recover, learn the land." Talon stood, moving toward the curtained corner of the cabin. He returned with a folded blanket and a worn leather satchel. "Tomorrow I'll start teaching you what you need to know to survive here. But tonight, you sleep." He spread the blanket near the fire, then placed the satchel beside it. "There's a clean shirt in there, and a comb. Not much, but it's yours." Clara stared at the small offerings, something tight and hot building behind her eyes. It had been so long since anyone had given her anything without expecting something immediate in return. "Thank you," she whispered. Talon nodded and retreated to his corner of the cabin, pulling the curtain closed behind him. Within minutes, Clara heard his breathing slow and deepen into sleep. She sat alone by the fire, wrapped in the blanket, and let herself cry silently for everything she'd lost and everything she might be stepping into. The tears felt like release and reckoning both. When they finally stopped, Clara wiped her face and lay down on the bedroll Talon had prepared. The floor was hard, but she'd slept on worse. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the desert night sang with insects and distant animal calls. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara Bennett felt almost safe. She closed her eyes and let exhaustion pull her under. Morning came with brutal brightness and the smell of coffee. Clara woke to find Talon already up, moving around the cabin with quiet efficiency. He'd rebuilt the fire and set a pot of beans to simmer. The coffee pot sat on the hearth, steam rising from its spout. "Drink," he said, handing her a cup as she sat up. "Then we walk the property." Clara accepted the coffee gratefully. It was strong enough to strip paint, bitter and scalding, but it cleared the fog from her head. She dressed quickly in the clean shirt Talon had given her, worn soft from use, smelling faintly of smoke and sage, and followed him outside. The desert in daylight was a different world. Red rock mesas rose like ancient sentinels to the east and west, their faces striped with layers of rust and cream and deep burgundy. The land between them rolled in gentle waves of sand and scrub, dotted with creosote bushes, prickly pear, and the occasional defiant mesquite tree. The sky stretched overhead in a dome of impossible blue, empty of clouds. It was harsh, unforgiving, beautiful in a way that hurt. Talon walked with long, easy strides, his boots leaving clean prints in the sand. Clara followed, her own steps less certain. He pointed out landmarks as they went, the dry wash that flooded during monsoon season, the stand of cottonwoods that marked the creek bed, the rocky outcrop where he'd spotted a mountain lion last spring. "That's the northern boundary," he said, gesturing toward a line of weathered posts barely visible in the distance. 200 acres, if the claim holds. Most of it's worthless for farming, but there's enough water to support a small herd. Goats, maybe. Cattle, if we're lucky. "We?" Clara asked. Talon glanced at her. If you stay. They walked in silence for a while, following the curve of the creek bed. It was dry now, just a ribbon of pale sand cutting through darker earth, but Clara could see the high watermarks on the banks, evidence of the violent floods Talon had mentioned. How do you survive out here? She asked. What do you eat when the beans run out? Hunt, trap. There's jackrabbit, quail, sometimes deer if you're patient. I trade in Gila Bend once a month, furs and leather goods for flour, salt, ammunition. He paused. It's not easy, but it's mine. The fierceness in those last two words made Clara look at him more closely. Talon's face was still impassive, but there was something fierce and unyielding in the set of his shoulders, the way he scanned the horizon like he was daring it to try and take this from him. This land had cost him something, was still costing him. What happens if the claim gets denied? Clara asked quietly. Then I lose everything my father built. Everything he died for. Talon's voice was flat, but his hands had curled into fists. And the land gets sold to the highest bidder, probably some Eastern investor who'll never set foot here. It'll sit empty while the government pretends they're opening the frontier. Clara understood. This wasn't just about property. It was about being seen, being counted, mattering. She knew what it felt like to be erased. They returned to the cabin as the sun climbed toward noon. Talon went to check his snares while Clara explored the interior more carefully. She found a root cellar dug into the earth beneath the floorboards, stocked with clay jars of preserves, dried corn, and salted meat. There was a rain barrel outside, half full despite the drought, and in the corral she discovered a single mule, ancient, sway-backed, but alert. When Talon returned with 2 rabbits slung over his shoulder, Clara was waiting with questions. Teach me, she said. He raised an eyebrow. Teach you what? Everything. How to skin game, how to start a fire without matches, where the safe water is, what plants I can eat and which ones will kill me. She crossed her arms. If I'm going to be your wife, even on paper, I'm not going to be useless. Talon studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded and handed her one of the rabbits. First lesson, he said, field dressing. Ikan. The next 8 days passed in a blur of hard work and harder lessons. Talon was a patient teacher, but he didn't coddle. He showed Clara how to gut and skin a rabbit, then watched impassively while she fumbled through it herself, trying not to gag. He taught her to identify edible plants, the young pads of prickly pear, the seeds of mesquite pods, the bitter greens that grew near the creek. He walked her through the basics of fire building, water conservation, and reading the sky for weather. Clara's hands blistered, then calloused. Her back ached from hauling water and firewood. But she didn't complain, couldn't afford to. At night, they ate together in silence, sitting on opposite sides of the fire. Talon would clean his rifle or work on tanning a hide, while Clara mended her torn dress or practiced knot tying with scraps of rope. They didn't talk much. There was no need. On the 7th night, Clara broke the silence. Tell me about your father. Talon's hand stilled on the leather he'd been working. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, he was a good man, quiet, strong. He believed if you worked hard enough, the world would let you keep what you'd built. A pause. He was wrong. I'm sorry. Don't be. He lived the life he chose. That's more than most people get. Talon resumed his work, his face unreadable. What about you? What are you running from? Clara hesitated, then slowly she told him. About Copper Bend, about Silas Crow and his wandering hands, his threats when she rebuffed him. About the night he'd cornered her in the back room of the boarding house, drunk and mean, and how she'd grabbed the first weapon she could reach. I don't know if I killed him, she finished quietly. I didn't stay to find out, but even if he lived, there'll be consequences. Men like Crow don't forgive women who fight back. Talon listened without interrupting, his dark eyes steady on hers. Then we'll make sure he doesn't find you, he said when she finished. It wasn't a promise. It was a statement of fact. Clara felt something shift in her chest, a small, fragile thing that might have been trust. Bus. On the 8th day, they rode to Gila Bend. The town was little more than a collection of adobe buildings clustered around a dry plaza. A general store, a cantina, a blacksmith, and a small church with a crooked cross on top. Dust hung in the air like a curtain. The circuit preacher was a gray-haired man named Reverend Walsh, thin as a rail and twice as stern. He looked Clara up and down with obvious disapproval. "This the woman?" he asked Talon. "Yes." "She understand what she's agreeing to?" "I do," Clara said sharply. Walsh's eyebrows rose, but he didn't argue. He produced a worn Bible and a ledger book, then led them through a perfunctory ceremony in the church's shadowed interior. The whole thing took less than 10 minutes. "Sign here," Walsh said, pointing to a line in the ledger. Clara signed her name carefully. Clara Bennett Greyhawk. The new surname felt strange on the page. Foreign, but also strangely solid. Talon signed below her, his handwriting surprisingly neat. Walsh witnessed both signatures, then closed the book with a snap. "You're married in the eyes of the law and the Lord," he said. "May you find what you're looking for." It didn't sound like a blessing. They rode back to the cabin in silence as the sun turned the sky to fire. Clara's mind churned with 1,000 conflicting thoughts, but she kept them to herself. Beside her, Talon sat easy in the saddle, his face as calm as ever. When the cabin came into view, Clara felt an unexpected flutter of something that might have been relief. Home, she thought, then corrected herself. No, not home, just shelter. But as they dismounted and Talon began unsaddling the mule, Clara looked at the rough cabin, the struggling garden plot, the vast, empty desert beyond, and wondered if maybe, just maybe, the difference didn't matter as much as she'd thought. That night, for the first time, Clara Bennett Greyhawk slept without nightmares. The first week of their marriage passed in careful silence and deliberate distance. Clara woke each morning before dawn to find Talon already gone, checking traps, mending fence posts, or hauling water from the creek. She would rebuild the fire, set coffee to boil, and begin whatever task seemed most urgent. Sweeping the packed earth floor, patching gaps in the walls with mud and grass, sorting through the meager supplies in the root cellar to plan meals that would stretch their stores through the coming months. They worked around each other like two strangers sharing a stagecoach, polite, careful not to touch, speaking only when necessary. But the silence wasn't hostile, it was watchful. They were still learning each other's rhythms, testing the boundaries of this arrangement they'd made. On the 8th morning, Clara found Talon standing outside the cabin, staring at a patch of cleared ground near the western wall. A shovel leaned against his shoulder. His jaw was tight with frustration. "What's wrong?" she asked. "This." He gestured at the dirt. "I've tried 3 times to plant squash here. Beans, even corn. Nothing takes. The soil's too poor, or the water's wrong, or—" He stopped, shaking his head. "The inspector's going to want to see cultivation. Proof we're working the land, but I can't make anything grow." Clara studied the barren patch. The earth looked pale and lifeless, more sand than soil. But along the edges, she noticed something. Thin runners of green creeping in from the native scrub. Some kind of vine with small, tough leaves. "What's that?" she asked, pointing. Talon glanced down. "Desert gourd. It's a weed. Grows everywhere. Chokes out everything else." "Can you eat it?" "The fruit's bitter. Not worth the effort." Clara crouched down, running her fingers through the sandy soil. An idea was forming, fragile and half-formed. "What if we're fighting the wrong battle?" Talon frowned. "What do you mean?" "You're trying to grow what worked wherever your mother came from. Santa Fe soil, Santa Fe water, but this isn't Santa Fe." She stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "What if we planted things the desert wants, things that already know how to survive here?" "Like what?" "I don't know yet, but there has to be something." Clara met his skeptical gaze. "Let me try. Worst case, we're no worse off than we are now." Talon considered this for a long moment. Then he held out the shovel. "It's yours," he said, "but I'm not wasting water on experiments." "Fair enough." Clara took the shovel and got to work. Over the next week, she explored every corner of their 200 acres, studying what grew wild. The prickly pear that flourished in the driest soil. The agave that stored water in thick, fibrous leaves. The mesquite trees that dropped pods full of sweet, nutritious meal. She collected seeds, dug up small plants, and began transplanting them near the cabin in careful, deliberate rows. Talon watched her efforts with quiet skepticism, but didn't interfere. He had his own work, reinforcing the cabin's roof, digging a deeper well, hunting for meat to cure and store. They moved through their days in parallel lines that rarely intersected. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the distance between them began to close. It started with small things. One evening, Clara looked up from grinding mesquite pods to find Talon watching her with an odd expression. "What?" she asked. "You hum when you work," he said. Clara hadn't realized. "Does it bother you?" "No." He turned back to the rifle he was cleaning. "It's just different, having someone else here." "Different good or different bad?" Talon was quiet for a moment. "Just different." Another night, Clara woke to find the fire nearly dead and Talon still awake, sitting with his back against the wall, staring at nothing. "Can't sleep?" she asked quietly. He startled slightly, as if he'd forgotten she was there. "Old habit. I spent 2 years sleeping light, listening for claim jumpers or—" He stopped. "Doesn't matter. I'll bank the fire." "I can do it." "You should rest." Clara sat up, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. "So should you. When's the last time you slept through a full night?" Talon's laugh was short and bitter. "I don't remember." She studied him in the dying firelight. There were shadows under his eyes, deep lines bracketing his mouth. He carried tension in his shoulders like a yoke. "You can't keep watch forever," Clara said softly. "Someone has to." "Then we'll take turns. You sleep first half of the night, I'll sleep second. That way one of us is always rested." Talon looked at her sharply. "You do that?" "We're partners in this, aren't we? Even if it's just on paper." Clara pulled the blanket tighter. "Besides, I'm a light sleeper anyway. Comes from years in boarding houses where the walls are thin and the men are drunk." Something shifted in Talon's expression, a crack in the careful mask he wore. "All right," he said finally. "We'll try it." That night, for the first time since his father's death, Talon Greyhawk slept for 6 unbroken hours, and Clara sat watch by the fire, listening to the desert breathe. The partnership deepened in unexpected ways. Clara discovered that Talon couldn't read well. He knew enough to sign his name and recognize common words, but anything more complex left him frustrated and angry. One evening, she found him staring at a letter from the Territorial Land Office, his jaw clenched tight. "What does it say?" she asked. "I don't know, that's the problem." He thrust the paper at her. "It came last month when I was in Gila Bend. The postmaster said it was important, but I can't make sense of half the words." Clara took the letter and read it slowly. Her expression darkened with each line. "It's a notice of review," she said. "They're questioning your claim again, saying you haven't met the minimum requirements for permanent habitation and land improvement." She looked up. "When did you file your original claim?" 3 years ago, right after my father died." "And they've been fighting you the whole time?" "In one way or another." Talon's voice was flat. "They say the paperwork's incomplete or the boundaries are unclear or I haven't made sufficient improvements. Every time I fix one problem, they find another." Clara read the letter again, anger building in her chest. The language was deliberately obscure, designed to confuse and intimidate. But beneath the bureaucratic maze, the message was clear. Prove you belong here, or we'll take it from you. "This is wrong," she said. Talon shrugged. "It's the law." "No, the law is supposed to be fair. This is just cruelty dressed up in legal words." Clara set the letter down carefully. "Do you want to fight it?" "I've been fighting it for 3 years." "Then let me help." She met his gaze. "I can read. I can write. And I spent 6 months working for a lawyer's wife back in Kansas City. I learned how these bastards think. If you teach me about the land, I'll teach you how to fight them with their own weapons." Talon looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out a small wooden box from beneath his bedroll. Inside were more letters, official documents, maps with disputed boundaries marked in fading ink. Years of bureaucratic warfare, all stuffed into a box he couldn't fully understand. "Where do we start?" he asked. "With teaching you to read," Clara said. "Every word in every one of these letters. Then we write back, and we don't stop writing until they give you what you're owed." That night, by firelight, Clara began teaching Talon his letters. He was a slow student, made stubborn and self-conscious by years of shame, but he was also determined. Each evening after the day's work was done, they would sit together while Clara walked him through words, sounding out syllables, connecting letters to meaning. This is boundary, she would say, pointing to the document. And this is permanent habitation. If you're going to fight them, you need to know what they're saying about you. Talon would repeat the words, his deep voice stumbling over unfamiliar combinations. His frustration was palpable, but he never quit. And slowly, grudgingly, the words began to make sense. In return, Talon taught Clara the desert. He showed her how to track animals by their prints, the distinctive drag marks of a sidewinder, the neat paired holes left by a jackrabbit, the broad paw of a mountain lion. He taught her to read the sky, to recognize the subtle shift in wind that meant a storm was building miles away. He walked her through the seasons of the land, when the mesquite pods ripened, when the prickly pear bore fruit, when the creek would flood, and when it would run dry. The desert will teach you if you listen, he said one afternoon as they knelt beside a stand of young agave plants Clara had transplanted. But it doesn't forgive mistakes. Like people, Clara said. Talon glanced at her. Yes. Like people. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, pulling weeds and checking the moisture in the soil. Clara's garden was beginning to take shape. Rows of prickly pear and agave, a patch of desert marigolds for their medicinal properties, even a few chili plants she'd bartered for in Gila Bend. Nothing like the lush gardens she'd seen in greener territories, but it was life where there'd been none before. It's working, Talon said quietly. Clara sat back on her heels, shading her eyes against the sun. What is? This. The garden. The arrangement. He gestured vaguely between them. I didn't think it would. You thought I'd run? I thought you'd realize what a hard life this is and leave. Most people would. Clara pulled off her work gloves, studying her calloused palms. I've had hard lives before, Talon. Working 14-hour days in boarding houses where the owner waters down the soup and the guests think you're part of the furniture. Sleeping 4 to a room in tenements where the rats are bold and the landlords are cruel. She looked up at him. This is hard, but it's honest, and no one here treats me like I'm invisible. Talon's expression softened almost imperceptibly. You're not invisible. Neither are you. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition deeper than words. They were both people the world had tried to erase, fighting to be seen. The silence that followed was different from before, less watchful, more settled. Come on, Talon said, standing and offering his hand. I want to show you something. Clara took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. His palm was rough and warm, calloused from years of hard labor. He released her quickly, but the brief contact lingered. He led her north, away from the cabin, following a narrow game trail that wound between stands of creosote and cholla. The sun blazed overhead, but a slight breeze made the heat bearable. After 20 minutes of walking, the trail opened onto a natural rock formation, a shallow cave carved into the base of a mesa, its mouth facing south to catch the winter sun. My father brought me here when I was 7, Talon said. He said his people used to shelter here during the hottest part of summer. The rock stays cool even when the desert's trying to cook you alive. Clara stepped into the shade of the cave and immediately felt the temperature drop. The walls were smooth stone, marked with faint pictographs, handprints, spirals, the outlined shapes of deer and birds. It's beautiful, she whispered. I come here sometimes. When things get... Talon trailed off, searching for words. When I need to remember why I'm fighting, Clara traced one of the handprints with her finger. It was small, a child's hand pressed into the rock centuries ago. Some young person declaring, I was here, I existed. Thank you for showing me, she said. Talon nodded. They stood together in the cool silence, two people learning to trust. But the peace didn't last. 3 weeks into their marriage, a rider appeared on the eastern horizon. Clara was hanging laundry, Talon's spare shirt, and her own worn dress, when she spotted the dust plume. Her stomach clenched with sudden fear. Out here, visitors meant trouble. Talon, she called. He emerged from the cabin, rifle already in hand. He'd seen the rider too. They stood together, watching the figure approach. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. What if it's Crow? What if he found me? But as the rider drew closer, Clara realized it wasn't Crow. It was a different kind of danger. The man who reined up before their cabin was lean and weather-beaten, with pale eyes that missed nothing. He wore a dusty suit and a tin star pinned to his vest, a U.S. Marshal's badge. "Talon Greyhawk?" the Marshal asked. "That's right." The Marshal's gaze shifted to Clara, assessing her with cold professionalism. "And you are?" "Clara Greyhawk," she said, lifting her chin. "His wife." The Marshal's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's so. Funny, I was told Talon Greyhawk lived alone." "Things change," Talon said flatly. "What do you want, Marshal?" "Vance. Marshal Thomas Vance out of Tucson." He dismounted, moving with the careful grace of a man used to trouble. "I'm here on official business. There's a complaint been filed against you." Clara's blood ran cold. Talon's expression didn't change, but she saw his knuckles whiten on the rifle stock. "What kind of complaint?" Talon asked. Marshal Vance pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Says here you're occupying federal land without proper authorization. That your claim is fraudulent and you've been squatting illegally for over 3 years. I filed my claim legally, paid the fees, met every requirement they set. Then you won't mind showing me the documentation." It was phrased as a suggestion, but Clara heard the threat beneath. This wasn't a friendly visit. This was an investigation. Talon's jaw tightened. "Who filed the complaint?" "I'm not at liberty to say." "Like hell you're not. This is my land, my home. I have a right to know who's trying to take it." Marshal Vance's expression hardened. "You'll know when the territorial office decides you need to know. Right now, I need to see your papers, your improvements, and any witnesses who can verify continuous habitation." Clara stepped forward before she could stop herself. "I can verify it." Vance's pale eyes fixed on her. "You're his wife. Your testimony's compromised." "How convenient," Clara said sharply. "The law requires a man to be married to strengthen his claim, but then dismisses his wife's word because she's married to him. That's not justice, Marshal. That's a trap." Vance's mouth twitched. "Careful, Mrs. Greyhawk. I'm just doing my job." "Then do it honestly," Clara shot back. "Don't pretend this is about verification when it's really about finding an excuse to seize the land." Talon's hand closed gently on her arm. A warning. Clara fell silent, but she didn't step back. Marshal Vance studied them both for a long moment. Then he said, "Show me the cabin, show me your improvements, and show me your papers. If everything's in order, I'll put that in my report." "And if it's not?" Talon asked. "Then the territorial office will make a decision about your claim." Vance's tone was neutral, but Clara heard the unspoken threat. "And you won't like that decision." They spent the next hour walking Marshal Vance through every corner of their property. Talon showed him the reinforced cabin, the expanded well, the cleared fields. Clara showed him her garden, the preserved food stores, the household items that proved permanent habitation. Vance took notes in a small leather book, his expression unreadable. When they returned to the cabin, Talon produced the wooden box of documents. He spread them on the table. The original claim filing, receipts for fees paid, maps of the surveyed boundaries, letters from the territorial office confirming his application. And the marriage certificate, signed and witnessed. Vance examined each document carefully. Too carefully. Like he was looking for something specific. Finally, he straightened. "Everything appears in order," he said slowly. "For now." "For now?" Clara echoed. "The territorial inspector will make the final determination. I'm just here to verify basic compliance." Vance tucked his notebook away. "But I'll tell you straight, there are people who don't want to see this claim succeed, people with money and influence." "Who?" Talon demanded. Vance hesitated. Then, in a lower voice, "A man named Silas Crow has been asking questions about land parcels in this area. Says he's interested in expanding his mining operations. He's got friends in the territorial government." Claire's vision grayed at the edges. The world tilted. "Crow. He found me." Talon's hand found hers, gripping tight, the only thing keeping her upright. Marshal Vance noticed the reaction. His eyes narrowed. "You know Crow?" "No," Clara managed. Her voice sounded distant, hollow. "Never heard of him." It was a terrible lie, and Vance clearly didn't believe it, but he didn't push. "Well," the marshal said carefully, "if you do encounter Mr. Crow, I'd advise you to be cautious. He's a man who gets what he wants, one way or another. He moved toward his horse. I'll file my report. The inspector should arrive within 3 months. Make sure everything's in order. He mounted and rode away without looking back. Clara stood frozen, Talon's hand still gripping hers. Clara, he said quietly, who is Silas Crow to you? She couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The desert sun felt like ice. Clara. The man I told you about, she whispered. The one I ran from in Copper Bend. The one who… Her voice broke. Talon's expression went utterly still. He's here, looking for land. Looking for me? No. Talon turned her to face him, his hands on her shoulders. He's looking for land. If he knew you were here, Vance would have said something. Crow's searching blind. For now. But when the inspector comes, we'll deal with it. Talon's voice was iron. This is your home now. You're my wife on paper and in law. Crow has no claim to you. You don't understand what he's capable of. Then tell me. Clara looked into Talon's dark eyes and saw no judgment, only steady, unyielding resolve. So she told him everything, the full story this time, holding nothing back. Crow's position as a mine owner in Copper Bend, his reputation for taking what he wanted, land, resources, women, the way he'd cornered her, his hands bruising her wrists, his breath hot against her neck. The moment she'd grabbed the fire poker and brought it down against his skull with all the strength desperation could give her. I heard bone crack, she finished, her voice shaking. There was blood, so much blood. And I ran. Talon listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, You defended yourself. I might have killed him. If you did, the world's better for it. Talon's tone was matter of fact. Men like that don't stop. They take and take until someone stops them. But the law protects men like Crow. You know that. I know that. He released her shoulders but didn't step back. But out here, on this land, the law is what we make it, and I won't let him touch you. Clara wanted to believe him, but fear had sunk its claws deep. What if he recognizes me when the inspector comes? She asked. Then we'll handle it, together. You don't owe me that kind of risk. Talon's laugh was short and sharp. Clara, you stood in front of a federal marshal and called out the system for being rigged. You didn't have to do that. You could have stayed quiet, let me fight alone. But you didn't. He met her gaze. We're partners. That means we face threats together. Something warm and fierce bloomed in Clara's chest. She'd spent so long fighting alone, trusting no one, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand beside her. All right, she said, together. That night they sat up late making plans. If Crow was sniffing around the territory, they needed to strengthen their claim beyond any possible challenge. That meant more improvements to the land, more documentation, more proof of permanent habitation and productive use. It also meant preparing for trouble. Talon began teaching Clara to shoot. He started with the basics, how to hold the rifle, how to sight down the barrel, how to breathe steady and squeeze rather than pull the trigger. Clara's first few shots went wild, kicking up sand 20 feet from the target, but she was a quick study, and fear made her focused. By the end of the first week, she could hit a tin can at 30 yards. By the end of the second week, she could hit it consistently. Good, Talon said, watching her reload. Now practice until you can do it in the dark, half asleep, with your hands shaking from fear, because that's when you'll need it most. Clara practiced. Meanwhile, Talon fortified the cabin. He reinforced the door with iron brackets. He built shutters for the windows that could be barred from inside. He dug a shallow trench around the perimeter and filled it with rocks and broken glass. Not enough to stop a determined attacker, but enough to slow them down and make noise. They were preparing for war, but they were also building something else. The garden Clara had planted began to flourish. The prickly pear put out new pads, green and healthy. The agave sent up tall stalks. The chili plants bore small, fierce peppers that made their eyes water and their mouths burn, but also flavored their meals and could be dried for trade. Clara began experimenting with recipes, learning to cook with what the desert provided. Mesquite pod flour mixed with water made a dense, sweet bread. Prickly pear fruit boiled down into a thick syrup. The tough greens from various plants could be stewed with salt pork and beans into something almost good. Talon ate everything she made without complaint, even when the experiments failed spectacularly. "This is terrible," Clara admitted one night, staring at a pot of gray, glutinous mush that had started as an attempt at porridge. "I've had worse," Talon said, spooning it into his mouth. "When?" "Army rations. Missionary school when I was 8. My own cooking." He swallowed with effort. "This ranks somewhere in the middle." Clara laughed despite herself. "You're a terrible liar." "I know. But he ate the whole bowl anyway." These small moments, shared laughter over failed meals, quiet companionship while cleaning rifles, the easy way they'd learned to move around each other in the cabin's tight space, built something neither of them had expected. Not love. Not yet. But the foundation it might grow from. One night, 6 weeks into their marriage, Clara woke to find Talon standing in the doorway, staring out at the moonlit desert. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly. "I keep thinking about what Vance said, about Crow having friends in the government." Talon's voice was low, troubled. "What if the inspector's already been bought? What if none of this matters? The garden, the improvements, the marriage. What if they've already decided to take the land?" Clara rose and moved to stand beside him. The desert night was cool and vast, stars scattered like diamonds across black velvet. "Then we fight," she said simply. "With what? We have a rifle and determination. They have the law. We have the truth. We have proof of what we've built." Clara looked up at him. "And we have each other. That has to count for something." Talon turned to face her. In the moonlight, his features looked softer, younger, vulnerable. "Why are you still here, Clara? You could leave. Take your chances somewhere else. You don't have to stay and face Crow." "Yes, I do." "Why?" Clara considered the question. Why was she still here? It wasn't just survival. She could survive elsewhere. It wasn't just the legal protection of Talon's name, though that helped. It was because for the first time in her life, she was fighting for something that mattered. Not just existing, not just enduring, but actually building something. And she was doing it beside someone who saw her not as a burden or a convenience, but as an equal. "Because this is my home too now," she said finally. "Because I'm tired of running, and because you're worth fighting for." Talon stared at her, something raw and unguarded in his expression. Then slowly, he reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered for just a moment against her cheek. "Get some rest," he said quietly. "We've got hard days ahead." Clara nodded and returned to her bedroll. But she lay awake for a long time, her cheeks still warm where he'd touched her, wondering what it meant. The next morning, they found fresh horse tracks circling the property. Someone had been watching the cabin in the night. Talon crouched beside the tracks, his fingers tracing the deep impressions in the sand. 3 horses, maybe 4. They'd circled the cabin twice, staying just beyond rifle range, then headed east toward the road to Gila Bend. "How long ago?" Clara asked, her hand resting on the pistol Talon had given her to wear at her hip. "Few hours before dawn, while we were both asleep." His jaw tightened. "They were watching, learning our patterns." Clara's stomach nodded. "Crow's men? Maybe. Or just drifters looking for an easy target." But Talon's tone said he didn't believe that. He stood, scanning the horizon with hard eyes. "Either way, we can't afford to be caught off guard again." They spent the morning preparing. Talon moved supplies into the root cellar. Ammunition, dried food, water containers. Clara helped him reinforce the cabin's defenses, nailing heavy planks across the inside of the door and fashioning crude shutters that could be dropped over the windows at a moment's notice. "If they come during the day, we'll see them from a distance," Talon said, loading his rifle with methodical precision. "But at night, in the dark, we're vulnerable. We need a warning system." Clara thought for a moment. "Bells, like they use on cattle. We could string wire around the perimeter, low to the ground, with bells attached. Anyone trying to approach would trip them." Talon looked at her with something like admiration. "That might work. We'd have to set them far enough out that we'd have time to react, but close enough that the desert wind doesn't set them off constantly." "I can do it." "You've got other work." "Not alone. We stay together from now on." It wasn't a suggestion. They worked side by side through the afternoon heat, stringing thin wire between stakes driven into the hard ground, attaching small bells Clara had bartered for months ago in Gila Bend. She'd bought them on impulse, thinking they might be cheerful additions to the cabin. Now they might save their lives. As the sun began its descent, painting the desert in shades of amber and rust, Clara paused to wipe sweat from her face. Her hands were blistered again, the calluses torn open by the rough wire. But the pain felt distant, unimportant. "We're turning this place into a fortress," she said quietly. Talon hammered in another stake. "That's what it needs to be." "Is this what you imagined when you decided to stay and fight for the land?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I imagined proving I belonged, making something my father would have been proud of. I didn't imagine having to defend it with guns and wire and bells." He looked at her. "I didn't imagine having a partner in it either." Clara met his gaze. The late sun caught the silver streak in his hair, making it gleam like polished metal. There was dirt on his face and exhaustion in the lines around his eyes, but there was also something fierce and unyielding that called to something equally fierce in her. "Well," she said, "you're stuck with one now." The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Could be worse. Could be better too." "Could it?" Talon asked, and there was something in his voice, something warm and uncertain, that made Clara's breath catch. Before she could answer, the bells rang. The sound was faint but unmistakable, a silvery chiming from the eastern perimeter. Both of them froze, then moved as one. Talon grabbed his rifle. Clara drew her pistol. They positioned themselves on opposite sides of the cabin's door, weapons ready. "Could be an animal," Clara whispered. "Could be." But Talon didn't lower his rifle. They waited. The bells rang again, closer now, then fell silent. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Her palms were slick with sweat. She tightened her grip on the pistol, remembering everything Talon had taught her. "Breathe steady. Sight down the barrel. Don't pull the trigger until you're certain," a voice called out from the gathering dusk. "Talon Greyhawk, I'm coming in peaceful. Don't shoot." Talon's shoulders relaxed fractionally, but he didn't lower the rifle. "Identify yourself." "Name's Martin Reed. I've got business to discuss." Clara looked at Talon. He shook his head slightly. He didn't know the name. "State your business from where you are," Talon called back. A figure emerged from the brush, hands raised high. A man in his 50s, stocky and gray-bearded, wearing a battered hat and dusty trail clothes. He stopped well short of the cabin, keeping his hands visible. "I'm unarmed," Reed said. "Just want to talk. It's about Silas Crow." Clara's blood turned to ice. Talon's expression went flat and dangerous. "What about him? Can I approach? My arms are getting tired." Talon considered, then, "Slow. Keep your hands where I can see them. If you reach for anything, I'll put a bullet in you." Reed nodded and walked forward carefully. As he got closer, Clara could see he was exactly what he appeared to be, a working man, weathered by years of hard labor, with honest worry etched into the lines of his face. He stopped 10 feet from the cabin. "Thank you. I know you don't know me from Adam, but I needed to warn you." "About Crow," Talon said flatly. "Yes. I worked one of his mines up in Copper Bend for 3 years. Good pay, terrible conditions. But that's not why I'm here." Reed's gaze shifted to Clara, and recognition flickered in his eyes. "You're the woman from the boarding house, the one who fought him off." Clara couldn't speak. Her throat had closed. Reed turned back to Talon. "Crow didn't die, but he came close. Skull fracture, the doctor said. Laid him up for weeks, and when he finally got back on his feet, he was different, meaner, obsessed. He fired half the mine workers and started asking questions about the woman who'd run, where she might have gone, who might be hiding her." "How did you find us?" Talon asked. "I didn't. Not directly. But I've got a cousin who works at the Territorial Land Office in Tucson. He told me Crow's been buying up information about homestead claims in the Southern Territories, specifically claims filed by men living alone who might have recently married." Reed's expression was grim. "Your name came up, along with about a dozen others. Crow's checking each one personally." Clara found her voice. "Why? Why go to all this trouble?" Reed looked at her with something like pity. "You humiliated him, made him look weak in front of his workers, his business partners. Men like Crow can't let that stand. It's not about justice or revenge, it's about power. As long as you're out there somewhere, free and unpunished, you're proof he can be defied. So he's coming here, Talon said. It wasn't a question. I believe so. Maybe not today, maybe not next week. But soon. Reed shifted his weight. I quit working for him the day I heard what he'd done to you, ma'am. What he tried to do? I've got daughters. I couldn't stomach it, but that means I've got no money, no prospects. I was hoping... He trailed off, looking uncertain. Hoping what? Clara asked. That I could work for you, in exchange for food and a place to sleep. I'm good with my hands, carpentry, metalwork, farming, and if Crow comes, you'll need more than 2 people to stand against him. Talon and Clara exchanged a long look. There were 1,000 reasons to refuse. Reed was a stranger. They could barely feed themselves, let alone hire help. Trusting him could be a fatal mistake. But Clara saw the desperation in Reed's eyes, the same desperation she'd carried in the desert when Talon had given her water and an impossible choice. We can't pay you, she said. Don't need pay. Just need to sleep with a clear conscience. Talon lowered his rifle slowly. You work hard, you pull your weight, and you follow orders when trouble comes. You can stay. But if you betray us, if you're playing some game for Crow, I will put you in the ground. Understood? Reed nodded. Understood. And I swear on my daughter's lives, I'm here to help, not harm. All right then. Talon stepped aside. Clara will show you where you can sleep. We've got beans on the fire and work starting at dawn. Reed's relief was palpable. Thank you, both of you. Clara led him to the small lean-to Talon had built against the cabin's north wall, originally meant for storing tools. It was cramped and drafty, but it was shelter. It's not much, she said. It's more than I had this morning. Reed set down his bedroll. Ma'am, I need you to know what Crow did to you wasn't your fault. And what you did to him was justice, plain and simple. Don't let anyone tell you different. Clara's throat tightened. Thank you, she whispered. That night, the 3 of them sat around the fire eating beans and hard bread. Reed told them what he knew about Crow's operations. The mines he owned, the men he employed, the violence he was willing to use to get what he wanted. He's got maybe 8 or 10 men loyal to him, Reed said. Hard types. The kind who don't ask questions as long as the pay's good. If he brings them all, you'll be badly outnumbered. Then we'll need to be smarter, Talon said. Use the terrain. Make them think twice about attacking. Or we run, Clara said quietly. Leave before he gets here. Both men looked at her. I won't run, Talon said. This is my land, my father's land. I've spent 3 years fighting for it, and I'm not giving it up now. Even if staying means dying? Even then, his voice was iron. But you don't have to stay, Clara. You could go to Prescott or Santa Fe or anywhere Crow won't think to look. I'd understand. Clara stared into the fire, watching the flames dance and twist. She thought about running again, about the empty years ahead, always looking over her shoulder, always waiting for Crow to appear, about the loneliness of it, the slow erosion of hope. Then she thought about the garden she'd planted, the cabin she'd helped fortify, the partnership she'd built with Talon, hard-won and honest. No, she said, I'm staying. Clara, this is my home too, my fight, and I'm done running. She looked at Talon. If Crow wants me, he'll have to come through both of us. Something blazed in Talon's eyes, pride, gratitude, something deeper that neither of them had words for yet. Reed cleared his throat. Well then, I guess we'd better get ready for war. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Reed proved his worth immediately. He reinforced the cabin's walls with additional support beams, built a second water cistern hidden behind the structure, and fashioned crude but effective barriers that could be deployed quickly to create defensive positions. He worked from dawn until well past dusk, pausing only for water and quick meals. Where'd you learn all this? Clara asked one afternoon, watching him expertly notch a log. War between the states. I was just a boy, but old enough to build fortifications for the Union Army in Tennessee. Some things you don't forget. Clara handed him a dipper of water. Were you afraid during the war? Reed wiped his mouth. Every damn day. But being afraid doesn't mean you run. Sometimes it means you dig in and fight harder, because the alternative's worse than dying. She understood that now. Meanwhile, Talon began training both Clara and Reed in coordinated defense tactics, how to cover each other's positions, how to reload under fire, how to fall back and regroup without exposing themselves to attack. "If they come at night, they'll try to burn us out," Talon said, drawing lines in the dirt to illustrate his point. "Fire's the fastest way to force people from a fortified position, so we need water ready, buckets, wet blankets, anything we can use to smother flames quickly." "And if they come during the day?" Clara asked. "Then we use the sun. Make them approach from the east, where they'll be squinting into the glare. We take positions in the shade where we can see clearly." Talon looked at both of them. "But the most important thing is not to panic. They'll try to overwhelm us with noise and numbers. We stay calm, we conserve ammunition, and we don't waste shots." Clara practiced until her hands shook from exhaustion. She practiced in bright sun and gathering dusk. She practiced with Reed calling out directions and Talon shouting to simulate the chaos of combat. And slowly, grudgingly, she began to feel something like confidence. But beneath the preparation, fear simmered. It came to a head one night when Clara woke gasping from a nightmare. She'd been back in Copper Bend, in the boarding house, with Crow's hands around her throat and his face looming over hers, twisted with rage and sick satisfaction. She sat up, pressing her hands to her face, trying to breathe. "Clara?" Talon's voice came soft from across the cabin. "You all right?" She couldn't answer. The nightmare's grip was too strong. She heard him move, and then he was there, kneeling beside her bedroll. "Hey, look at me." Clara lowered her hands. In the darkness, she could just make out his features, calm and steady. "Breathe with me," he said quietly. "In through your nose, out through your mouth, like when you're aiming." She tried. Her breath came ragged at first, but Talon kept breathing with her, slow and deliberate, until her racing heart began to calm. "I can't stop seeing his face," she whispered. "I keep thinking about what he'll do if he catches me." "He won't." "You can't promise that." "No. But I can promise I'll fight beside you. And so will Reed. You're not alone anymore, Clara. Remember that." She nodded, but tears were sliding down her cheeks now, hot and bitter. "I'm so tired of being afraid." "I know." Talon hesitated, then reached out and took her hand. His palm was rough and warm, completely engulfing hers. "But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to stand even when you're terrified, and you've been doing that since the day you walked into the desert." Clara looked at their joined hands. Something shifted in her chest. A lock turning, a door opening. "Talon," she said softly, "when this is over, if we survive, what happens to us?" He was quiet for a long moment. "What do you want to happen?" "I don't know. A month ago I would have said I'd leave as soon as the inspector signed off on your claim. But now—" She took a shaky breath. "Now I can't imagine leaving. And that terrifies me almost as much as Crow does." Talon's thumb brushed across her knuckles, a gesture so gentle it made her ache. "Why does it terrify you?" "Because caring about things means they can be taken away. And I've had too many things taken already. So have I." His voice was rough with old grief. "My father, my mother, the certainty that hard work and honesty matter. But you know what I've learned?" "What?" "That the things worth having are worth the risk of losing. And you, Clara, you're worth the risk." She stared at him, her heart hammering for entirely different reasons now. "We should probably survive first," she managed, "before we figure out what we are to each other." Talon's smile was barely visible in the darkness. Probably wise. But he didn't let go of her hand, and Clara didn't pull away. They sat together in the quiet dark until her breathing steadied and the nightmare's grip finally released. When she lay back down, Talon stayed close, his presence a solid reassurance against the fear. "Sleep," he said quietly. "I'll keep watch." And for the first time since the horse tracks had appeared, Clara slept deeply. 3 days later, a messenger arrived from Gila Bend. The boy couldn't have been more than 15, skinny and nervous, riding a mule that looked even more exhausted than he did. He pulled up short when he saw 3 armed figures emerge from the cabin. "I've got a message for Talon Greyhawk," he stammered. "I'm Greyhawk." The boy fumbled in his saddlebag and produced a sealed envelope. "Man paid me $2 to deliver this. Said it was urgent." Talon took the envelope, his expression unreadable. Who was the man? Didn't give his name, but he was fancy, good suit, expensive horse, had a scar here. The boy traced a line from his left temple to his jaw. Clara's stomach dropped. She knew that scar. She'd put it there with the fire poker. Talon dismissed the boy with a coin and broke the seal. Clara and Reed crowded close as he unfolded the letter. The handwriting was elegant, almost mocking in its precision. Greyhawk, I understand you've recently acquired a wife. Congratulations on your marriage. I hope she's worth the trouble she's caused. I'm a reasonable man, so I'll make you a reasonable offer. Sign over your land claim to me. I'll pay fair market value, and we can part ways peacefully. Your wife can keep her freedom, and you can start fresh somewhere else. Refuse, and I'll come take what I want anyway. The land, the claim, and the woman who thinks she can hide behind a piece of paper and a half-breed's name. You have 1 week to decide. Silas Crow. The silence that followed was murderous. Reed spoke first. That son of a bitch. Clara couldn't speak. The words half-breed burned like acid, and she saw the way Talon's jaw had gone tight, the way his hands trembled slightly with barely contained rage. He's trying to provoke you, she said quietly. Make you angry enough to do something reckless. It's working. Talon's voice was cold and flat, dangerous. What are you going to do? Reed asked. Talon looked at both of them. What we've been preparing for. We fortify. We wait. And when he comes, we remind him that some things can't be taken. They have to be earned. He'll bring men, Clara said. Then we'll be ready for them. Talon, no. He cut her off, but not unkindly. This is my line, Clara. This is where I stand. He can have the land over my dead body, and he can't have you at all. Not while I'm breathing. The ferocity in his voice made something in Clara's chest crack wide open. She stepped forward and took the letter from his hands, then deliberately tore it into pieces and threw them into the fire. Then we stand together, she said, and we don't give that bastard an inch. Reed grinned fiercely. Damn right. They spent the next week transforming the property into a true fortress. Talon and Reed dug shallow trenches and filled them with sharpened stakes, creating barriers that would break up any mounted charge. Clara prepared firefighting supplies and organized their ammunition, making sure they could reload quickly under pressure. They stockpiled food and water in the root cellar and created escape routes in case the cabin became untenable. Every night, they took turns on watch, rifles loaded and eyes scanning the darkness. The bells rang twice more, once for a coyote, once for wind, but the third time was different. It was just past midnight when the silvery chiming cut through the desert silence. Clara, on watch, immediately woke Talon and Reed. How many bells? Talon asked, already reaching for his rifle. Eastern perimeter, multiple triggers. They moved to their positions. Clara took the west window, Reed the south, Talon the door. The moon was a thin crescent, offering little light. Shadows moved in shadows. Then a voice rang out, amplified by the desert quiet. Greyhawk, your week's up. Come out and let's talk like civilized men. Crow. Clara would know that voice anywhere, smooth and cultured on the surface with poison underneath. Talon didn't respond, didn't move. His rifle remained steady, aimed at the darkness. I've got 6 men with me, Crow continued. You're outnumbered and outgunned. Be smart about this. Sign the papers and we'll ride away peaceful. Still Talon said nothing. Claire could hear the frustration creeping into Crow's voice now. You're protecting a whore who brain damaged me with a fire poker. You really think she's worth dying for? Clara's hands tightened on her rifle. Rage and shame and fear warred in her chest. Then Talon's voice cut through the night, calm and carrying. She's my wife, and this is my land. You're trespassing on both. Leave now, or we'll defend what's ours. Crow's laugh was ugly. Your wife? That's rich. You think a piece of paper makes her respectable? She's still the same filthy... Talon fired. The shot cracked like thunder, and Clara heard a yelp from the darkness. Not Crow, but one of his men. Next one's for you, Crow, Talon said. And I don't miss twice. Silence. Then the sound of horses moving, pulling back beyond rifle range. This isn't over, Crow shouted. We'll be back. And when we come, we're burning that shack to the ground with you in it. Hoofbeats retreated into the desert night. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her whole body was shaking. Is everyone all right? Reed asked. Fine, Talon said, but his knuckles were white on the rifle stock. Clara crossed to him. You hit one of them. Winged him. Wanted them to know we're serious. They'll come back, Reed said grimly. And next time they won't bother talking first. I know. Talon finally lowered the rifle. He looked at Clara, and there was something fierce and protective in his eyes that made her breath catch. Are you all right? I'm fine. But Talon, what he said about me was the desperate bleating of a coward. Talon's voice was firm. Don't give his words power. You're worth 10 of him, and he knows it. That's why he's so determined to break you. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. Thank you. It's the truth. They maintained watch through the rest of the night, but Crow didn't return. As dawn broke across the desert, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the three of them gathered around the fire for coffee and strategy. They'll come back tonight, Talon said, or tomorrow night. Soon. They want to use darkness as cover. Then we use it too, Reed said. Make them think we're where we're not. Set false positions, maybe even fake a retreat to draw them in close. Clara listened to them plan, but her mind was working on a different problem. Crow had 6 men, maybe more. Even with their preparations, a direct assault would likely overwhelm them through sheer numbers. They needed an advantage, something unexpected. An idea began to form. What if we take the fight to them? She said quietly. Both men looked at her. What do you mean? Talon asked. They're expecting us to hide in the cabin and defend. What if we didn't? What if we set a trap instead? She outlined her plan. It was risky, maybe even reckless, but it was also the kind of bold stroke that might just work. When she finished, Reed was grinning. That's either brilliant or suicidal. Probably both, Clara admitted. Talon studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. All right, we'll do it. But we do it my way, with contingencies and escape routes. And if it starts going wrong, we fall back immediately. Agreed? Agreed. They spent the day preparing. As the sun began its descent, they moved into position, hearts pounding, weapons ready, waiting for the darkness and the violence they knew was coming. And when the moon rose over the desert, painting everything in silver and shadow, the bells began to ring. The bells sang their warning across the darkness, a cascade of silver sound that set Clara's nerves ablaze. She crouched behind the rock outcrop 50 yards north of the cabin, her rifle braced against stone still warm from the day's heat. Her heart hammered so hard she could hear it in her ears, a drumbeat of fear and determination. From her position, she could see the cabin clearly, every window dark, smoke rising from the chimney as if the occupants were settling in for the night. Inside, lanterns burned behind crude shutters, casting moving shadows that suggested people moving about. But the cabin was empty. The lanterns were hung on strings, swaying in the slight breeze Reed had created by leaving the back window cracked. It was a trap, and now they waited to see if Crow would take the bait. Clara's hands were slick with sweat despite the desert's cooling night air. She wiped them on her skirt one at a time, never taking her eyes off the eastern approach. Somewhere in the darkness to her left, Talon waited in similar position. Reed was hidden south of the cabin, covering the rear. They'd spent hours positioning themselves, testing sight lines, making sure they could provide overlapping fields of fire without risking hitting each other. The plan was simple, brutal, and relied entirely on Crow's arrogance. Let him think they were cornered in the cabin. Let him commit his forces to an assault. Then hit him from 3 directions while his men were exposed and confused. It could work, or they could all die in the next hour. Clara forced herself to breathe slowly, remembering Talon's training. Steady hands, clear mind, controlled breath. She sighted down the rifle barrel, checking her aim for the 100th time. The weapon felt heavy and awkward, but also strangely reassuring. She wasn't helpless anymore. Wasn't defenseless. The bells fell silent. Clara strained her ears, listening. There, the soft creak of leather. The muffled sound of horses moving carefully. Men's voices, low and tense, giving orders. Check the perimeter first. Make sure there's no surprises. That voice. Crow. Clara's stomach clenched with visceral hatred. Dark shapes moved at the edge of her vision, silhouettes against the star-dusted sky. She counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4. No, 5 men spreading out, approaching from the east just as Talon had predicted. They moved with the practiced care of men who'd done this before, weapons drawn, using whatever cover the sparse desert provided. One of them kicked over a bucket Reed had deliberately left near the cabin wall. The clatter echoed in the quiet. "Someone's home," a rough voice said. "I can smell coffee." Clara had brewed a full pot before they'd evacuated, leaving it on the hearth. Another detail to sell the illusion. "Good," Crow said. He was still mounted, hanging back while his hired guns did the dangerous work. "Scatter around the building. When I give the word, light it up. Flush them out and we'll pick them off as they run." Clara's blood turned to ice. She'd expected an attack, but hearing it laid out so casually, the cold-blooded plan to burn them alive, made rage rise like bile in her throat. 2 men approached the cabin's front door while the others spread out to cover the windows. One carried a torch, its flame guttering in the night breeze. The other had a rifle trained on the door. "On 3, the man with the torch said. 1, 2. A gunshot cracked from the south. Reed's position. The man with the torch screamed and dropped it, clutching his leg. The flame hit the ground and immediately began spreading across the oil-soaked rags Reed had scattered there earlier, part of their contingency plan, turning Crow's own tactic against him. Fire bloomed in the darkness, bright and vicious, creating a wall of light between the attackers and the cabin. "It's a trap," someone shouted. "They're not in there." Chaos erupted. The hired guns spun around, trying to locate the shooter, their carefully planned assault dissolving into confusion. Crow's horse reared, panicked by the sudden flames. Another shot rang out from Talon's position. Clara saw one of the men fall, clutching his shoulder. Now. It had to be now. Clara sighted on the man nearest her position, a tall figure trying to drag his wounded companion away from the spreading fire. She aimed for his leg, squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard the man cry out and collapse. "North side!" someone yelled. "They're flanking us!" More gunfire erupted. Muzzle flashes brightened the darkness. Clara ducked behind her rock cover as bullets whined overhead, chipping stone and kicking up sand. Her hands shook as she reloaded. Brass cartridge from her pocket, into the chamber, bolt action smooth despite her trembling fingers. She risked a glance over the rock. The scene was pure chaos now. The fire had spread to one of the wooden barriers Reed had built, creating a second source of light and smoke. Men were shouting, shooting at shadows, unable to coordinate. Crow was still mounted, trying to control his terrified horse while screaming orders no one could hear over the gunfire and crackling flames. Clara saw Talon rise from cover, silhouetted briefly against the fire. He fired twice in rapid succession, and another of Crow's men went down. But then return fire forced him back behind the rocks, bullets sparking off stone. "Fall back!" Crow shouted. "Regroup at the horses!" But the panic had set in. The hired guns were breaking, running for their mounts. One of them didn't make it. Reed's rifle spoke again, and the man collapsed in a heap. Clara tracked Crow through her sights. He was wheeling his horse around, preparing to flee with the others. She had a clear shot. One bullet, and this nightmare could end. Her finger tightened on the trigger. Then she saw him pull something from his coat, a bottle with a rag stuffed in the neck. He lit it with a match, and the makeshift bomb blazed to life. "If I can't have the land, neither can you," Crow screamed. He hurled the bottle toward the cabin. Clara's shot went wide as she jerked in surprise. The bottle arced through the air, trailing fire, and shattered against the cabin's roof. Flames exploded across the dry wooden shingles. "No!" The cry tore from her throat. The cabin, their home, their fortress, everything they'd built, was burning. Clara abandoned her position, running toward the structure without thinking. Behind her, she heard Talon shout her name, but the roar of flames drowned out his words. She could see fire eating through the roof, spreading fast, reaching for the walls. Reed was already there, throwing bucket after bucket of water from the cistern onto the flames. But it wasn't enough. The fire was too big, too hungry. Clara grabbed another bucket, her hands blistering as she hauled water and flung it uselessly at the inferno. Heat blasted her face, singeing her hair and eyebrows. Smoke choked her lungs. "It's no use," Reed shouted. "We have to let it go." "No, everything we have is in there, and we'll be in there too if we don't move." Strong hands grabbed Clara's shoulders, pulling her back. Talon. His face was black with soot, his eyes fierce. "The root cellar," he said urgently. We can save the cellar if we stop the fire from spreading down. Clara nodded, coughing. They worked together, frantically clearing away burning debris, creating a fire break between the main cabin and the underground storage. The heat was tremendous, stealing the air from her lungs. Embers rained down like hellish snow. Behind them, gunfire erupted again. Crow's men had regrouped. "They're coming back," Reed shouted. He dropped his bucket and grabbed his rifle. Clara turned to see riders approaching through the smoke and firelight, weapons blazing. The flames had worked against them now, illuminating their positions while Crow's men attacked from the darkness beyond. A bullet struck the ground near Clara's feet. Another shattered the bucket she'd been holding. Talon shoved her toward cover behind what remained of the cabin's stone chimney. "Stay down!" But Clara could see the tactical situation deteriorating. They were pinned between the burning cabin and the attacking riders. The carefully planned defense had collapsed into desperate survival. Reed fired from his position, but there were too many targets, too much chaos. One of the riders broke through, heading straight for them, his pistol raised. Clara lifted her rifle, but her hands were shaking too badly. The shot went wild. The rider bore down on her, and she could see his face now, young, maybe 20, terrified despite his aggression. He was going to shoot her. She could see his finger tightening on the trigger. Then Talon stepped between them. The shot took him in the side, spinning him around. He went down hard, his rifle clattering away. "Talon!" Clara's scream was raw and broken. The young rider wheeled his horse around for another pass, but Clara was already moving. She dropped her rifle and dove for Talon's fallen weapon. Her hands closed around familiar wood and metal. She brought it up, sighted on the rider's center mass, and fired. The man toppled from his saddle. Clara didn't watch him fall. She was already on her knees beside Talon, her hands pressed against the wound in his side. Blood, too much blood, poured between her fingers, hot and slick. "Stay with me," she choked out. "You hear me? Stay with me!" Talon's eyes were glazed with pain, but he focused on her face. "Clara, don't talk. Save your strength." She ripped fabric from her skirt, wadding it against the wound, trying desperately to slow the bleeding. Reed appeared beside her, his face grim. "How bad?" "Bad. We need to get him somewhere safe, somewhere I can—" Another gunshot, closer this time. Reed returned fire without looking, his movements automatic. "We're sitting ducks here," he shouted. "The cabin's lost, we're out in the open, and they've got us pinned." Clara looked around wildly. He was right. The cabin was fully engulfed now, flames reaching toward the night sky. They had no cover except the crumbling chimney, and Crow's remaining men were circling like wolves. Then her eyes fell on the root cellar. The entrance was still clear, protected by the fire break they'd created. "There," she said, pointing. "Help me get him down there." Together, they half-carried, half-dragged Talon to the cellar entrance. He groaned with every movement, his face gray with pain and blood loss. They lowered him down the crude ladder into the darkness below, Clara following immediately while Reed covered their retreat. The cellar was cool and dark, smelling of earth and preserved food. Clara couldn't see anything in the blackness, but her hands found Talon's body, found the wound still pumping blood. "Reed!" she called up. "I need light, and the medical supplies from—" Her words cut off as she remembered. The medical supplies had been in the cabin. Everything had been in the cabin. All their carefully stockpiled provisions, their ammunition, their spare weapons, all of it burning. Reed appeared at the cellar entrance, silhouetted against the firelit sky. "They're regrouping again. I count 4 still mounted, and Crow's with them. They'll rush us any minute." "Then you need to stop them." Clara's voice was steel. "I need time to stop this bleeding, or Talon dies. Buy me that time." Reed nodded and disappeared. Moments later, she heard his rifle speak, again and again, a steady rhythm of defiance. Clara worked by feel in the darkness, her hands slick with Talon's blood. She found the wound, a clean entry just below his ribs, but she couldn't tell if it had hit anything vital. The exit wound in his back was worse, ragged and bleeding freely. "Clara," Talon's voice was weak. "Leave me. Get out of here. Shut up," she said fiercely. "Just shut up and let me work." She found clay jars in the darkness. Pickles, preserves, she couldn't tell. She smashed one against the wall, using the cloth that had sealed it to pack the wounds. Talon hissed in pain, but didn't cry out. "You're wasting time," he gasped. "I'm already—" "You're not dying," Clara's voice cracked. "You don't get to give up. Not now. Not after everything." "Clara, We're partners, remember? You don't get to leave me alone with this fight." Tears were streaming down her face, mixing with soot and blood. "You promised me we'd face everything together. So you don't get to die and break that promise. You understand me?" Talon's hand found hers in the darkness, gripping weakly. "Bossy woman." "Damn right I am." Above them, the gunfire intensified. Clara heard Reed shout something, then the thunder of hooves very close, men's voices angry and coordinating. "They're rushing the position," Talon said. "Reed can't hold them alone." Clara knew he was right. She could hear it in the pattern of gunfire. Reed was being overwhelmed, forced to retreat. She had a choice to make. Stay here and try to save Talon while Reed died defending them, or go up there and fight, leaving Talon to bleed out in the darkness. Some choices weren't really choices at all. Clara grabbed Talon's rifle from where she'd dropped it. She checked the load, 3 rounds left. Not many, but enough if she made them count. "I'll be right back," she told Talon. "Clara, no." But she was already climbing the ladder, rifle in one hand, the other slick with blood. She emerged into hell. The cabin had collapsed into itself, a skeleton of burning timbers throwing wild shadows across the desert. Reed was behind the stone water trough, bleeding from his arm but still firing methodically. 3 riders were closing in from different angles while Crow watched from a safe distance, his face twisted with rage and satisfaction. Clara raised the rifle. Her first shot took down the nearest rider's horse. She couldn't bring herself to kill the animal, but it fell hard, throwing its rider. Her second shot caught one of the other riders in the leg. He screamed and wheeled away. The third rider saw her and changed course, charging straight at her position. Clara aimed for him, but the rifle clicked empty. She dropped it and drew the pistol from her belt, Talon's pistol, the one he'd given her weeks ago when he'd started teaching her to shoot. The rider was 20 feet away, 15, 10. Clara fired. The bullet caught him in the chest. He swayed in the saddle, then toppled backward, his horse galloping away riderless into the night. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of flames and the ragged sound of breathing. Clara stood in the firelight, pistol still raised, covered in blood and soot and tears. She scanned the darkness for more threats but saw only Reed emerging from cover, his face a mask of exhaustion and pain. "Where's Crow?" she asked. Reed pointed toward the eastern darkness. "Ran like the coward he is. Soon as he saw his men going down, he turned tail and fled." Clara wanted to pursue, wanted to end this once and for all. But then she heard Talon call her name from below, weak and desperate. The choice made itself. She ran back to the cellar, scrambling down the ladder. In the faint light from the burning cabin above, she could just make out Talon's face, deathly pale. "Still here," he whispered, "still breathing." Clara laughed, the sound half sob. "You better be. I just killed for you. You owe me. Put it on my tab." She kissed his forehead, his cheeks, his lips. Quick, desperate touches, reassurance that he was alive, that they both were. Reed appeared at the cellar entrance. "We need to move him. Dawn's coming, and if Crow comes back with reinforcements, we're finished." "Move him where?" "The cabin's gone. We've got nothing." "The cave," Talon said. "North, the one with the handprints. Cool, sheltered, defendable." Claire remembered. The sacred space Talon had shown her carved into the base of the mesa. "Can you ride?" she asked. "Do I have a choice?" Together, Clara and Reed got Talon back up the ladder. The old mule was still there, miraculously unharmed and only mildly traumatized by the violence. They draped Talon across its back, Clara walking beside him to keep him from falling while Reed gathered what little could be salvaged from the root cellar. As they walked away from the burning remains of their home, Clara looked back once. The cabin was gone, reduced to embers and ash. The garden she'd planted with such care was trampled and scorched. Everything they'd built lay in ruins, but they were alive. That had to count for something. The journey to the cave took an hour of agony for Talon, who drifted in and out of consciousness, moaning with each step the mule took. Clara talked to him constantly, nonsense and plans and promises, anything to keep him focused on her voice. "We'll rebuild," she told him, "bigger and better, with real windows and a proper floor, and I'm planting roses. I don't care if they're not native to the desert, I'm planting them anyway, and you can't stop me." "Roses," Talon mumbled. "Impractical woman." "That's right, and you're stuck with me." When they finally reached the cave, Reed built a small fire while Clara made Talon as comfortable as possible on a bed of their salvaged blankets. By the growing light, she could finally see the full extent of his injuries. The bullet had passed through cleanly, missing vital organs by what looked like inches. But he'd lost a lot of blood, and the wounds needed cleaning to prevent infection. Clara worked with steady hands despite her exhaustion, cleaning the wounds with precious water, packing them with strips of clean cloth. Talon drifted in and out, sometimes lucid, sometimes delirious. "My father would have liked you," he said at one point. "I would have liked him too," Clara replied, stitching the exit wound with needle and thread from the small sewing kit she kept in her pocket. "You fight like him, fierce, stubborn." "Takes one to know one." Talon's hand caught hers. "Clara, if I don't make it, you're making it. End of discussion. Listen to me." His grip tightened with surprising strength. "If I don't make it, the land is yours. The claim, everything. My will. It's in the box. The wooden box. It says so." Clara stared at him. "When did you write a will?" "After we married, wanted to make sure you'd be protected." His eyes were bright with fever. "You deserve to have something that's yours. A place no one can take from you." Tears blurred her vision. "Talon, promise me you'll keep fighting for it. Promise me you won't let Crow win." "I promise. But you're going to be here to fight with me, you stubborn bastard." He smiled weakly. "Stubborn. That's what my father used to call me." Then his eyes closed and he was asleep, or unconscious. Clara couldn't tell which. She sat beside him through the remainder of the night, one hand pressed against his chest to feel the steady rise and fall of breathing. Reed took first watch at the cave entrance, rifle across his knees. As dawn broke across the desert, painting the rocks in shades of pink and gold, Clara finally let herself cry. Not from fear or exhaustion, though she felt both, but from the terrible understanding of how close they'd come to losing everything, and how much she had to lose now. Somewhere in the chaos and violence, in the desperate partnership forged from necessity, she'd fallen in love with Talon Greyhawk, with his quiet strength and fierce protectiveness, with the way he saw her not as something to be rescued, but as someone to fight beside. With the life they'd been building together, hard and honest and real, and she'd be damned if she let Silas Crow take that away. Reed spoke quietly from the cave entrance. "Rider coming. One horse. Moving slow." Clara's hand went to her pistol, but she was too exhausted to stand. "If it's Crow, shoot him," she said flatly. But as the rider approached, Reed lowered his rifle. "It's Marshal Vance." The lawman dismounted outside the cave, his expression grim. He took in the scene. Clara covered in blood, Talon unconscious and wounded, Reed's defensive posture, and shook his head slowly. "I heard the gunfire last night," Vance said. "By the time I got here, your cabin was ashes, and there were bodies scattered across your property." "Crow attacked us," Clara said, her voice hoarse. "He tried to burn us out." "I know. I found him on the road to Gila Bend riding hard. He tried to tell me you were squatters who'd fired on him without provocation." Vance's mouth twitched. "But then I counted the bodies. 5 of his men dead or wounded. Not bad for a couple of squatters." "Are you here to arrest us?" Reed asked. "Should I be? Were you defending your legal property against an illegal assault?" Clara met the marshal's pale eyes. "Yes, that's exactly what we were doing." Vance nodded slowly. "Then I'm here to tell you that Silas Crow is facing charges of arson, attempted murder, and destruction of a legal homestead. I've sent word to Tucson for a judge. He'll stand trial." Clara couldn't speak. The relief was too overwhelming. "Your husband going to live?" Vance asked, nodding toward Talon. "Yes," Clara said fiercely. "He is." "Good. Because the territorial inspector's coming next week, delayed by weather, but he's coming. And after what you've been through, I'm going to personally recommend that your claim be approved without further contest." Vance adjusted his hat. "You've more than proven you're committed to making a life on this land." He left supplies, food, water, medical ointment, then rode away toward the smoking ruins of the cabin. Clara sat beside Talon and took his hand. His skin was warmer now, the fever breaking. His breathing had steadied. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "We won. The claim's going to be approved. We won." Talon's eyes fluttered open. "We?" "Yes, we. I'm not going anywhere. You're stuck with me, remember? His fingers laced through hers. Good. Was worried you'd come to your senses. Too late for that. Clara leaned down and kissed him gently. Now rest. We've got a home to rebuild. As Talon drifted back into healing sleep, Clara watched the sun rise over the desert that had tried so hard to kill them both. The land spread out in all directions, harsh and beautiful and unforgiving, and theirs. Finally, completely, undeniably theirs. The cave became their home for 3 weeks while Talon healed and they planned their next move. Clara tended his wounds with careful precision, changing bandages twice daily, watching for signs of infection that never came. His body was strong, hardened by years of frontier living, and it fought back against the injury with stubborn determination that matched his spirit. Reed made daily trips to what remained of the homestead, salvaging what little could be saved from the ashes. He returned each evening with small treasures: a cast-iron pot that had survived the flames, nails, and metal hinges, the wooden box containing their legal documents, miraculously intact in the root cellar. Each item felt like a victory. On the 5th day, Talon insisted on sitting up despite Clara's protests. "I'm not an invalid," he said, wincing as he shifted position. "And we need to talk about what comes next." Clara handed him a cup of weak broth made from rabbit bones and wild herbs. "What comes next is you healing. Everything else can wait. The inspector's coming in less than a week. We need a plan." "The plan is simple," Reed said from the cave entrance where he was cleaning his rifle. "We rebuild fast enough to show permanent habitation. Doesn't have to be fancy, just has to be standing." Talon shook his head. "It won't work. The cabin's gone. Even if we had materials, we couldn't build something substantial in 6 days. The inspector will see ruins and reject the claim." Silence fell over the cave. Clara felt the old fear creeping back. After everything they'd endured, would they lose the land anyway because of Crow's destruction? "Then we don't show him the cabin site," she said slowly. Both men looked at her. "What do you mean?" Talon asked. Clara's mind was racing, pieces fitting together. "The homestead law requires permanent habitation and improvement of the land. It doesn't specify where on the 200 acres that habitation has to be. What if we make this our permanent home?" She gestured around the cave. "It's shelter, it's defensible, and with some work, it could be made into a proper dwelling." Reed straightened, considering. "She's right. I've seen families living in worse, cliff dwellings up in the territories, dugouts in Kansas. As long as you can prove you're making productive use of the land and living here year-round, the location doesn't matter." Talon looked around the cave with new eyes. The space was larger than Clara had first realized, extending back into the mesa in a series of natural chambers. The main room where they sheltered was roughly 15 feet across, with a ceiling high enough to stand in. Smoke from their small fire rose naturally toward a crack in the rock above, creating a natural chimney. "It could work," he said quietly. "My father's people lived in places like this for centuries. It's more permanent than any wood structure." "Then that's what we do," Clara said firmly. "We turn this cave into a home. We show the inspector that we're not just surviving here, we're thriving." The next 6 days were a blur of relentless work. Reed used salvaged wood to build a proper door frame for the cave entrance, then constructed a heavy door from planks he'd recovered and new timber he cut from the cottonwoods by the creek. Clara organized the interior space, creating distinct areas for sleeping, cooking, and storage. She used rocks to build a proper fire pit with a flat stone surface for cooking, and fashioned shelves from wood and stone to hold their meager supplies. Talon, still weak but refusing to be idle, worked on smaller tasks, repairing tools, sorting through the documents they'd need for the inspector, teaching Clara to read the land survey map so she could answer technical questions if needed. On the 3rd day, Clara made the journey back to the burned cabin site. She stood in the ashes, her heart heavy, remembering the hours she'd spent building their life there. The garden she'd tended so carefully was scorched earth now. The walls that had sheltered them were blackened stumps. But as she picked through the ruins, she found survivors. The prickly pear she'd transplanted had tough, fibrous roots that had protected them from the worst of the fire. Several agave plants showed new green growth emerging from their centers. The desert marigolds were gone, but she knew where to find more. Clara dug up the surviving plants with careful hands and transplanted them near the cave, creating a new garden in a sheltered spot that caught morning sun. It wasn't much, but it was proof of cultivation, proof of intention, proof that they were building something meant to last. On the 5th day, Martin Reed announced he was leaving. They were sitting around the evening fire when he said it, his voice quiet but firm. "I'll stay through the inspection, make sure everything's settled, but after that, I'm heading north. Got a sister in Colorado who's been asking me to come help with her ranch." Clara felt a pang of loss. Reed had become more than hired help. He'd become a friend, a trusted partner in their fight. "You're always welcome here," she said. "You know that." Reed smiled. "I know, and I'll remember that. But you two don't need me anymore. You've got each other, and you've got this land. That's enough." Talon extended his hand. "Thank you. For everything. We wouldn't have survived without you." Reed clasped his hand firmly. "You would have. You're both fighters. I just helped even the odds." He looked at Clara. "Take care of him. He's stubborn enough to get himself killed trying to prove something." "I know," Clara said, fighting back tears. "I will." On the morning of the 6th day, they were as ready as they'd ever be. The territorial inspector arrived precisely at noon, riding a well-fed bay horse and wearing a suit that must have cost more than Clara and Talon's entire salvaged possessions combined. He was a thin, severe-looking man named Howard Blackwell, with wire-rimmed spectacles and a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. Marshal Vance accompanied him, along with 2 witnesses from Gila Bend, the postmaster and the owner of the general store. Clara stood beside Talon at the cave entrance, her spine straight and her chin high. She wore her cleanest dress, mended carefully where Crow's bullets had torn it. Her hair was pinned back neatly. She looked, she hoped, like a woman who belonged here. Talon wore his best shirt, also mended, and stood despite the pain Claire could see in the tightness around his eyes. His hand rested casually on his belt, near but not on his holstered pistol. A statement. We're peaceful, but not defenseless. Blackwell dismounted and surveyed the scene with an expression that gave nothing away. His gaze traveled from the cave entrance to the transplanted garden, to the smoke rising from their cooking fire, to the survey markers visible in the distance. "Mr. Greyhawk," he said formally, "I'm here to conduct the final review of your homestead claim. I understand there's been some difficulties. Our original cabin was destroyed in an attack by Silas Crow and his hired men," Talon said evenly. "Marshal Vance has the full report. We've established a new permanent dwelling here while we rebuild." Blackwell's eyebrows rose. "A cave dwelling? Unconventional. But legal," Clara interjected. "The Homestead Act specifies permanent habitation and productive use of claimed land. It makes no requirements about the type of structure, only that it be year-round and demonstrate intent to improve the property." The inspector studied her with new interest. "You're Mrs. Greyhawk?" "I am. Clara Bennett Greyhawk." She met his gaze without flinching. "And you reside here year-round with your husband?" "I do. We were married 4 months ago in Gila Bend. Reverend Walsh performed the ceremony and witnessed our signatures." She gestured to Reed. "Mr. Martin Reed can verify our continuous habitation, as can several traders from Gila Bend who visited to conduct business." Blackwell made notes in a small book. "I'll need to see documentation. Marriage certificate, land survey, proof of purchase, and fees paid." Talon produced the wooden box. Inside were all their carefully preserved documents, including letters from the territorial office, receipts, maps, and the marriage certificate. Blackwell examined each one with meticulous attention. While he worked, Marshal Vance spoke quietly. "For the record, I've documented Mr. Crow's attack on this property. 5 of his men were killed or wounded in the assault. Crow himself is currently in custody in Tucson awaiting trial. The evidence supports the Greyhawks' account completely." Blackwell nodded without looking up from the documents. "And the cultivation requirements?" Clara led him to the garden. It was small, still recovering, but unmistakably intentional. She explained each plant, the native species she'd selected, the irrigation system they were developing to channel seasonal creek water, the plans for expansion. "We're working with what the desert provides rather than fighting against it," she said. "Prickly pear for food and medicine, agave for fiber, an eventual harvest, mesquite for pods and shade. It's sustainable cultivation suited to the environment." Blackwell examined the plants with what might have been grudging respect. Practical. Most homesteaders try to recreate Eastern farms and fail within a year. We're not most homesteaders, Clara said simply. The inspector spent 2 hours examining every aspect of their claim. He walked the boundaries, verified the survey markers, inspected the cave dwelling and its improvements, questioned both Clara and Talon extensively about their intentions and capabilities. Finally, he returned to the cave entrance where the witnesses waited. Mr. and Mrs. Greyhawk, Blackwell said formally. I've completed my review of your homestead claim. Your documentation is in order. Your marriage is legal and properly recorded. You've demonstrated permanent habitation despite the destruction of your original structure, and you've shown innovative and practical approaches to land cultivation. Clara's heart hammered. She reached for Talon's hand and found it already reaching for hers. However, Blackwell continued, there are concerns about the viability of this claim given the recent violence. The territorial government has a responsibility to ensure settlers' safety. With respect, sir, Talon said, his voice steady, the desert is dangerous. Settlers die from drought, exposure, accidents, and animal attacks all the time. That's the nature of frontier life. The fact that we also faced human violence doesn't make us any less committed to this land. It proves how committed we are. We chose to stay and rebuild rather than abandon our claim, Clara added. We fought for this land, we bled for it, we nearly died for it. If that's not proof of commitment, I don't know what is. Blackwell studied them both for a long moment. Then he opened his portfolio and withdrew an official-looking document. Based on my review and Marshal Vance's testimony, I'm approving your homestead claim effective immediately, he said. You have 5 years to complete the full requirements for final patent, but your right to this land is now legally recognized. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Greyhawk. You're official homesteaders. Clara's knees went weak. Talon's hand tightened around hers, the only outward sign of the emotion she knew he was feeling. Thank you, Talon said, his voice rough. Blackwell handed him the document. Don't thank me. Thank yourselves. You've done the work. I'm just acknowledging it. He paused. For what it's worth, I've reviewed hundreds of homestead claims. Most people give up at the first real hardship. You two have faced more than most will in a lifetime, and you're still here. That counts for something. He mounted his horse and rode away, followed by the witnesses. Marshal Vance lingered a moment longer. Crow's trial is next month in Tucson, he said. You'll need to testify, both of you. We'll be there, Clara said. Vance nodded. Good. And Mrs. Greyhawk? What you did, standing up to him, defending your home, that took real courage. Don't let anyone tell you different. After he left, Clara and Talon stood together in the desert silence, holding the document that made everything official, everything real. We did it, Clara whispered. We did. Talon turned to face her, his dark eyes bright with emotion she'd never seen him show before. Clara, I need to tell you something. What? When I asked you to marry me, it was a business arrangement, a way to protect my claim and give you safety. That's all it was supposed to be. Clara's throat tightened. I know. But somewhere along the way, it became real for me. You became real for me. He raised his free hand to her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her cheek. I love you, Clara Bennett Greyhawk. Not because you helped me keep this land. Not because you fought beside me or tended my wounds, but because you're fierce and brave and stubborn, and being with you makes me want to be better than I am. Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks. Talon, I know we married for practical reasons. I know you might not feel the same way, but I needed you to know. I love you, and I want this marriage to be real in every way, not just on paper. Clara laughed through her tears. You stubborn, beautiful fool. I've loved you since the day you taught me to shoot and told me I was worth fighting for. Maybe even before that. I was just too scared to admit it. Talon pulled her close, and Clara went willingly, wrapping her arms around him and holding tight despite the way it must have hurt his healing wound. They stood together in the shadow of their cave home, two people who'd fought for the right to exist, to be seen, to matter. When they finally pulled apart, Reed was watching from a respectful distance, grinning. About damn time, he said. I was starting to think you two were going to dance around it forever. Clara threw a pebble at him, laughing. Mind your own business. Your business is my business for another few days. After that, you're on your own. Reed's grin softened. But seriously, I'm happy for you both. You deserve this. That night they celebrated with a feast cobbled together from their meager supplies: roasted rabbit, beans flavored with wild herbs, prickly pear fruit preserved in honey. Reed had traded for in Gila Bend. It wasn't much, but it tasted like victory. As the stars emerged overhead and the desert night cooled around them, Clara sat close to Talon, her head resting on his shoulder. "What do we do now?" she asked quietly. "We rebuild. Bigger and better, like you said. A real house this time, with proper windows and a floor that doesn't turn to mud when it rains." "And roses?" Talon smiled. "And roses. If you can keep them alive in this desert, I'll build you a whole garden of them. I'll hold you to that." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn down to embers. Then Clara said, "I want to testify at Crow's trial. I want to look him in the eye and tell everyone what he did, what he tried to do." "It won't be easy," Talon warned. "People will judge you. They'll say things." "Let them. I'm done hiding, done being ashamed of fighting back." She looked up at him. "He tried to erase me, tried to make me nothing. But I'm still here. We're still here, and I want him to know that he failed." Talon kissed her forehead. "Then we'll go to Tucson. We'll testify. And we'll make sure he pays for what he did." True to his word, Reed stayed through the end of the week, helping them begin construction on a new cabin. They chose a site near the cave, sheltered by the mesa but with clear sightlines in all directions. The structure would be stone this time, built from rocks gathered from the property. Slower to build than wood, but fireproof and permanent. On his last morning, Reed taught Clara how to mix mortar and showed Talon techniques for fitting stones together so they'd hold without excessive chinking. They worked together until noon, then stopped to share a final meal. "You'll write?" Clara asked as Reed prepared to leave. "I'm not much for writing, but I'll send word when I get to Colorado. Let you know how things are." He mounted his horse and looked back at them. "Take care of each other, and take care of this land. It's worth it." "We will," Talon promised. They watched Reed ride north until he disappeared into the heat shimmer, becoming part of the desert itself. Then they turned back to their work. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm. Wake before dawn, tend the garden and animals. They'd acquired 2 goats and a handful of chickens from a traveling trader. Work on the stone house until the midday heat became unbearable. Rest through the afternoon, then work again as the day cooled. Fall exhausted into bed each night, Clara curled against Talon's side, his arm wrapped protectively around her. The stone house grew slowly but steadily. 4 walls rose from the desert floor, mortared with mud and sand. A roof frame took shape. Windows were fitted with salvaged glass Clara had bartered for in Gila Bend. And through it all, Clara and Talon learned each other in ways they hadn't before. She learned that he hummed unconsciously while working, old songs his mother had taught him. He learned that she talked to the plants in her garden, encouraging them to grow. She learned the scars on his body, each one a story of survival. He learned the nightmares that still haunted her, and how to wake her gently from them. Their partnership deepened into something richer, more complex. They argued sometimes, about the best way to route water to the garden, about whether to trade for cattle or focus on goats, about 1,000 small decisions that made up their shared life. But the arguments never turned cruel, never weaponized their vulnerabilities against each other. They were building something together. Not just a house or a homestead, but a life based on mutual respect, hard-earned trust, and love that had been tested by fire and survived. 2 months after the inspector's approval, they made the journey to Tucson for Crow's trial. The territorial courthouse was an impressive adobe structure that dominated the main plaza. Inside, the courtroom was packed with spectators, miners who'd worked for Crow, businessmen with interests in his operations, curious townspeople drawn by scandal. Clara sat in the witness gallery, her hands folded calmly in her lap despite the trembling she felt inside. Talon sat beside her, solid and steady as stone. When Crow was led into the courtroom, Clara forced herself to look at him. He'd aged in the months since the attack, his face thinner, the scars she'd given him livid against pale skin. His eyes found hers across the room, and she saw the hatred there, raw and burning. She met his gaze without flinching and smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, but it said everything. You didn't break me. You didn't win. I'm still here. And you're the one in chains. The trial lasted 3 days. Witness after witness testified to Crow's attack on the Greyhawk homestead. Marshal Vance presented evidence. The bodies recovered from the property, the remains of firebombing materials, testimony from the surviving hired guns who'd turned on Crow to save themselves. On the 3rd day, Clara was called to testify. She walked to the witness stand with her head high, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Then she looked directly at the judge and began to speak. She told him about Copper Bend, about working honestly in the boarding house, about Crow's unwanted advances and her repeated refusals, about the night he'd cornered her, drunk and violent, intent on taking what she wouldn't give. I defended myself, she said clearly. I grabbed the nearest weapon and I fought back. Then I ran, because I knew no one would believe my word against his, because I knew the law protects men like Silas Crow while punishing women like me for daring to resist. The courtroom was absolutely silent. He tracked me down, Claire continued, found out where I'd gone, who'd given me shelter, and he tried to burn me alive for the crime of saying no, for the crime of surviving. She looked at Crow then. He stared back with undisguised loathing. But I did survive, Clara said softly, and I'll keep surviving. That's my testimony. The defense attorney tried to discredit her, suggesting she was a woman of loose morals who'd led Crow on, that her marriage to Talon was a sham designed to steal land. But Clara answered every question calmly, backed up by documentation and testimony from Reverend Walsh, the Gila Bend postmaster, and Marshal Vance himself. When Talon testified, he spoke with quiet intensity about the attack, about watching his home burn, about the choice to stand and fight rather than surrender what was rightfully his. His testimony was devastating in its simplicity. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty on all charges. Crow was sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison, with additional fines and forfeiture of his mining properties. The judge's final words rang through the courtroom. Mr. Crow, you used your wealth and position to prey on the vulnerable and destroy those who opposed you. This court will not tolerate such abuse. You will serve your full sentence, and you will reflect on the consequences of believing yourself above the law. As Crow was led away in chains, Clara felt something release inside her chest, a weight she'd been carrying since that terrible night in Copper Bend, the weight of fear, of shame, of wondering if she'd somehow deserved what he'd tried to do. She hadn't deserved it. She'd done nothing wrong, and now the law itself had said so. Outside the courthouse, Talon pulled her into his arms. It's over, he said. Truly over. He can't hurt you anymore. Clara pressed her face against his chest and let herself cry, not from sorrow, but from relief so profound it felt like being reborn. They stayed in Tucson for 2 more days, using the time to purchase supplies they couldn't get in Gila Bend. Glass for more windows, proper hinges and door handles, seeds for vegetables. Clara wanted to try growing, a small iron stove that would make winter cooking easier, and a rosebush. Just one, carefully packed in damp burlap, with instructions from the seller on how to keep it alive in desert conditions. You're really doing this, Talon said, watching Clara fuss over the plant. I told you I would. You said if I could keep it alive, you'd build me a whole garden. I'm going to regret that promise, aren't I? Absolutely, Clara grinned at him. But you'll do it anyway, because you love me. Damn right I will. The journey home took 3 days. When they finally crested the rise and saw the mesa in the distance, Clara felt her heart lift. There, the cave where they'd sheltered and survived. There, the stone house with its half-finished walls waiting for them to complete it. There, the garden she'd planted, green against red earth. Home. They threw themselves back into work with renewed energy. The stone house was completed by the end of summer, its thick walls keeping the interior cool even in brutal heat. Clara planted her rosebush in a carefully prepared spot near the front door, tending it with obsessive care until it established roots and sent out new growth. The garden expanded. Clara's experiments with native plants paid off, and by autumn they had a thriving collection of prickly pear, agave, desert marigolds, and even a few successful chili plants. She began trading produce in Gila Bend, building relationships with other settlers and townspeople. Talon built a proper barn for their growing collection of animals, goats, chickens, and eventually a small herd of cattle purchased with money from selling tanned hides. He repaired and expanded the irrigation system, channeling precious water to where it was needed most. And slowly, carefully, they built a life that was entirely their own. A year after the inspector's approval, they received a letter from Martin Reed in Colorado. His sister's ranch was thriving, and he'd met a widow with 3 children who made him laugh. He was thinking about settling down permanently. He sent his love and reminded them they'd always have a friend in the north. Clara read the letter aloud to Talon that evening as they sat on the porch he'd built onto the front of the stone house. Her rose bush bloomed beside them, improbable and beautiful, filling the desert air with sweetness. "Good for him," Talon said. "He deserves happiness." "So do we," Clara said. She set the letter aside and leaned against him. "Do you think we're happy?" Talon considered the question seriously, as he did everything. "I think we're building toward it. We've survived. We've fought and won. Now we're learning how to live without constantly looking over our shoulders." He kissed the top of her head. "Ask me again in another year." But Clara already knew the answer. She could feel it in the contentment that settled over her when she worked in her garden, in the joy of waking beside Talon each morning, in the pride of looking at everything they'd built with their own hands. They were happy, not despite the hardship, but because of it, because they'd earned every moment of peace they now enjoyed. The seasons turned. Winter brought cold nights and occasional snow that melted by mid-morning. Spring brought floods that filled the creek and nourished the land. Summer brought crushing heat that tested everything they'd built. Autumn brought harvest and preparation for the cycle to begin again. Through it all, Clara and Talon worked side by side. They expanded the house, adding a second room and a proper chimney. They increased their herds and improved their irrigation. They saved money and made plans for the future. And when the 5-year mark approached, the point at which they could file for final patent and own the land outright, they were ready. The same territorial inspector, Howard Blackwell, returned to conduct the final review. He arrived to find a thriving homestead where once there'd been only struggle and survival. The stone house stood solid and well-maintained with glass windows and a covered porch. The garden sprawled across half an acre, heavy with produce. The barn sheltered healthy animals. The land showed careful management and sustainable use. Blackwell walked the property with Clara and Talon, making notes and asking questions. His severe expression gradually softened into something like approval. "This is remarkable," he said finally. "I've reviewed your progress reports over the years, but seeing it in person, you've built something genuinely impressive here." "We've built a home," Clara said simply. Yes, you have." Blackwell signed the final documents with a flourish. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Greyhawk. This land is officially yours, full patent, free and clear." After he left, Clara and Talon stood together looking out over their property. 200 acres of desert that had tried to kill them, that they'd defended with blood and determination, that they'd transformed through sheer stubborn will into something productive and beautiful. "Your father would be proud," Clara said quietly. Talon's arm tightened around her shoulders. "So would yours." Clara thought about the parents she'd lost young, about the hard years that followed, about the long journey that had brought her here. She thought about the woman she'd been, desperate, running, convinced she had nothing left to lose. That woman wouldn't recognize who she'd become, wouldn't believe that the battered survivor stumbling through the desert would someday stand on her own land, beside a man who loved her, surveying a future full of possibility. "We should celebrate," Talon said. "How?" He smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed his serious face. "I'm going to build you that rose garden, a whole garden, like I promised. Not just one bush, dozens of them if you want." Clara laughed, bright and free. "That's going to be incredibly impractical." "I know, but you're worth it." They began planning immediately, marking out space near the house for Clara's rose garden. She ordered plants from catalogs, choosing varieties that might survive the desert heat. Some would surely fail, but others would adapt, would thrive, would prove that even delicate things could find strength in harsh places, like she had. As the years continued to pass, the Greyhawk homestead became known throughout the territory. Travelers would stop to see the stone house carved into the base of the mesa, the thriving gardens grown from native plants, the rose garden that bloomed impossibly in the desert. They would meet Clara and Talon, The quiet, fierce couple who'd fought off claim jumpers and built a life from nothing, and leave inspired. Some of those travelers were women running from bad situations, looking for a fresh start. Clara always gave them water, food, and honest advice. Some she directed to other homesteads looking for workers. Some she helped get to towns where they could start over safely. And a very few, she and Talon invited to stay, to learn the desert the way she'd learned it, to build their own strength in the shelter of the Greyhawk land. One of these women was Clara Bennett, who arrived 5 years after the final patent with 2 young children and bruises she tried to hide. Clara recognized the look in her eyes, the same desperation Clara had carried into the desert a lifetime ago. "Stay as long as you need," Clara told her. "There's a room in the house, and work if you want it. No questions asked, no debts owed." Sarah stayed 3 months, helping with the garden and the animals while her children played in the shade of the porch. She learned to shoot, to track, to survive. And when she finally left, heading north to family in Santa Fe, she looked like a different woman, stronger, certain. "Thank you," she said to Clara on her last morning, "for seeing me, for helping me remember I was worth saving." Clara hugged her tight. "You saved yourself. I just gave you space to do it." After Sarah left, Talon found Clara sitting on the porch, staring out at the desert. "You all right?" he asked. "I was just thinking about the woman I was when I arrived here, how lost I felt, how certain I was that I'd never be anything but broken." She looked up at him. "And now I'm helping other women find what you helped me find. It feels important. Like maybe everything we went through mattered for more than just us." Talon sat beside her and took her hand. "It mattered because we chose to make it matter. We could have given up, could have let Crow win, or the desert claim us, or the government erase us. But we didn't. We fought, and we built something worth fighting for." "And now we get to share it," Clara said. "Yes, now we get to share it." They sat together in the evening quiet, watching the sun paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The rose garden bloomed beside them. Dozens of bushes now, some struggling but many thriving. Their impossible beauty a daily reminder that delicate things could survive harsh places if they were tended with care and given room to put down roots. Clara thought about roots often now, how hers had been torn up so many times, by loss, by violence, by necessity. How she'd arrived in this desert with nothing, not even hope. How she'd put down tentative roots in hard soil, never expecting them to hold. But they had held, and grown, and spread deep into the earth until nothing could tear them free. This land was hers now. Not because a piece of paper said so, though it did. Not because she'd fought for it, though she had. But because she'd bled into it, wept into it, poured her heart and will and stubborn determination into every acre. The desert had tried to kill her. Instead, it had made her stronger than she'd ever imagined possible. And beside her sat the man who'd given her water when she was dying, shelter when she had nothing, partnership when she'd forgotten what it meant to be seen. The man who'd taught her that strength didn't mean facing everything alone. Sometimes it meant choosing the right person to stand beside. "I love you," she said, not for the first time, but with the same fierce certainty she always felt when saying it. "I love you too," Talon replied, his voice warm with the emotion he'd learned to show her. "Always." As stars began to emerge in the deepening blue above them, Clara leaned her head on Talon's shoulder and let herself feel the full weight of what they'd built. The house, the land, the life. All of it earned through blood and determination and love. They had survived. They had endured. They had transformed suffering into strength and fear into fierce belonging. The desert stretched around them, vast and beautiful and unforgiving. But it was theirs now, and they were its. Bound together by choice and struggle, by partnership and love, by the simple, powerful act of refusing to be erased. Clara Bennett Greyhawk closed her eyes and smiled. She was home. Not the place she'd been born, not the place she'd run from, but the place she'd chosen. The place she'd built with her own hands beside the man she loved. The place where she'd learned that being lost wasn't the end of the story. Sometimes it was just the beginning. And that the desert's greatest gift wasn't mercy or gentleness, but the chance to discover exactly how strong you could become when survival demanded everything you had to give. She'd given everything. And in return, she'd gained the whole world.